The industrial floor cleaner hummed across the polished concrete of Hangar 7 at Whitmore Air Force Base, guided by steady hands that had performed this same routine for over 15 years. Maria Santos pushed the machine with practiced efficiency. Her movements precise and economical as she navigated around the massive C-130 Hercules that dominated the space. At 4:30 a.m., the hangar was her domain, a cathedral of metal and silence where the only sounds were the soft whir of her equipment and the distant hum of the base's early morning operations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Maria wore the same navy blue uniform she'd donned every weekday for the past decade and a half, pressed work pants, a simple polo shirt with Whitmore Facility Services embroidered on the chest, and steel-toed boots that had been resoled twice. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, secured with a plain elastic band that had seen better days. At 52, she moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew her job intimately and took quiet pride in doing it well. She was, to most people on the base, completely invisible. The young airman who occasionally worked late maintenance shifts barely acknowledged her presence. The officers who strutted through the hangars during their inspections looked past her as if she were part of the equipment. The civilian contractors spoke around her, discussing technical specifications and mission parameters as though she couldn't hear or wouldn't understand. After 15 years, Maria had become as much a fixture of Whitmore Air Force Base as the aircraft themselves, present, necessary, but unworthy of notice. This morning was no different. As she methodically cleaned the oil stains from beneath the Hercules, her movements betrayed none of the complex emotions that swirled beneath her calm exterior. Most observers would see only a middle-aged cleaning woman going about her duties. They wouldn't notice the way her eyes automatically catalogued the aircraft's condition, noting a slight hydraulic leak near the starboard landing gear that the maintenance crew had missed. They wouldn't catch how her hands unconsciously traced familiar patterns in the air when she thought no one was looking, the muscle memory of a pilot running through pre-flight checklists. They certainly wouldn't recognize the distinguished flying cross recipient who had once commanded respect in these very hangars. The morning routine. Maria's workday began the same way it had for 15 years. She arrived at the Facility Services building at 4 a.m. sharp, signed in with the night security guard who had long since stopped bothering with small talk, and collected her equipment from the supply room. Her route through the base was carefully planned and efficiently executed. Hangars 1 through 8, the administrative buildings, the briefing rooms, and finally the officers' club. By 2 p.m., she would clock out, invisible once again as she walked to the employee parking lot and drove her modest Honda Civic back to her small apartment in the town of Millbrook, 20 minutes from the base. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The work itself was methodical but not mindless. Maria took genuine pride in maintaining the hangars to spotless condition. These aircraft represented millions of dollars of taxpayer investment and, more importantly, the safety of the men and women who flew them. A clean hangar wasn't just about appearances, it was about preventing foreign object debris that could damage engines, maintaining air quality for sensitive electronics, and creating an environment where maintenance crews could work safely and effectively. She knew every aircraft on the base by sight and sound. The throaty rumble of the C-130s, the sharp whine of the F-16 Fighting Falcons, the distinctive rotor wash of the helicopters, each had its own signature that spoke to her in a language few civilians could understand. When new aircraft arrived for temporary deployment, Maria would study them with the practiced eye of someone who understood aerodynamics, engineering, and performance specifications far better than her job description suggested. The other cleaning staff often wondered about Maria's intensity regarding her work. While they chatted during breaks and counted the hours until quitting time, she maintained a professional distance that bordered on aloofness. She was polite but not particularly social, competent but not attention-seeking, reliable but not ambitious for advancement within the facility services hierarchy. "She's a lifer," Rosa Gutierrez, a newer employee, had observed to their supervisor. "Acts like she's married to this place." The comment wasn't entirely wrong. Maria did have a relationship with Whitmore Air Force Base that went deeper than employment, though none of her colleagues could have guessed its true nature. Every morning as she drove through the main gate, past the monument honoring fallen airmen, she felt a complex mixture of pride, loss, and something that might have been homesickness. This had been her world once, in a way that transcended the simple exchange of labor for wages, invisible expertise. If Maria's coworkers failed to notice her unusual knowledge, the occasional military personnel who interacted with her were no more perceptive. She had learned to modulate her responses carefully, offering just enough competence to do her job well without revealing the depth of her understanding. When a young maintenance technician complained about difficulties accessing a particular component on an F-16, Maria would suggest a simple solution while phrasing it as a question: would it help if you removed that panel first? When visiting dignitaries toured the hangars, she made herself scarce, instinctively understanding that her presence might raise uncomfortable questions for everyone involved. The closest anyone had come to discovering her background was 3 years earlier, when Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base's first female wing commander, had been conducting an informal inspection of the facilities. Maria had been cleaning near a display case containing photographs of Whitmore's most distinguished aviators when the colonel paused to examine the images. "Remarkable women," Colonel Hayes had commented, apparently to herself. Captain Elena Rodriguez, first female pilot to fly combat missions from this base. Major Lisa Chen, Silver Star recipient. And this one, she pointed to a photograph near the bottom of the display. Major Rosa Delgado, Distinguished Flying Cross, Purple Heart, and Congressional Recognition for Valor in Combat. Flew 147 combat missions during Operation Enduring Freedom. They say she had the finest instincts of any pilot who ever served here. Maria's hands had tightened imperceptibly on her cleaning supplies, but she continued her work without comment. Colonel Hayes, unaware of the extraordinary coincidence unfolding behind her, had moved on after a few more moments of contemplation. Maria had avoided that particular display case for weeks afterward. The weight of anonymity, living with a hidden identity, was exhausting in ways that outsiders couldn't comprehend. Maria had chosen this life, but that didn't make it easy. Every day brought small reminders of who she had been and what she had accomplished. The sight of pilots in flight suits triggered memories of briefing rooms and mission planning sessions. The sound of aircraft engines starting up recalled the addictive rush of takeoff, the moment when tons of metal defied gravity through the marriage of physics and skill. The casual camaraderie she observed among the current squadron members reminded her of friendships forged in combat and lost to time and circumstance. She had developed coping mechanisms over the years. When the weight of anonymity became too heavy, she would spend her lunch break sitting on a bench near the flight line, watching aircraft land and take off while eating a sandwich from home. She told herself she was simply enjoying the fresh air, but the truth was more complex. These moments allowed her to reconnect with the part of herself that had once belonged in the sky, to remember that her current invisibility was a choice rather than a diminishment of her worth. At home, Maria maintained a small shrine to her former life in the back of her bedroom closet. Her dress blues hung in a garment bag, still bearing the ribbons and insignia she had earned through years of exemplary service. Her flight helmet sat on a shelf next to her Distinguished Flying Cross and the commendation letter signed by a general, whose name still carried weight in military aviation circles. Sometimes, late at night when sleep eluded her, she would sit quietly in her small living room and remember missions that had tested every skill she possessed, decisions that had meant the difference between life and death for the people under her command. These memories weren't entirely pleasant. Combat had left its marks on her psyche just as surely as it had on her body: a scar along her left shoulder from shrapnel, hearing loss in her right ear from an explosion that had occurred too close to her aircraft, and the persistent hypervigilance that made her automatically scan for threats in situations where civilians felt perfectly safe. The transition from Major Rosa Delgado to Maria Santos hadn't just been a change of name, it had been a fundamental reconstruction of identity that sometimes felt more like an amputation than a transformation. The day everything changed, the morning that would ultimately shatter Maria's carefully constructed anonymity, began like thousands of others. She arrived at the base at her usual time, collected her equipment, and began her rounds through the hangars. The only unusual element was the presence of a film crew in Hangar 3, documenting what appeared to be a routine maintenance procedure for some kind of Air Force promotional video. Maria had encountered such productions before and knew to give them a wide berth, Continuing her work while staying well outside the camera's field of view, she was cleaning the administrative offices adjacent to Hangar 7 when she heard the commotion outside. Raised voices, the sound of running footsteps, and then the distinctive alarm that indicated an emergency on the flight line. Through the window, she could see personnel rushing toward the runway where a damaged F-16 was attempting an emergency landing, trailing smoke from what appeared to be an engine fire. Maria's training kicked in automatically. Her eyes tracked the aircraft's approach, analyzing its speed, altitude, and the severity of the emergency. The pilot was fighting to maintain control, but something was wrong with the approach. The angle was too steep, the speed too high, and the aircraft was drifting left toward a group of maintenance vehicles that hadn't been cleared from the area. Without conscious thought, Maria dropped her cleaning supplies and moved toward the nearest radio, her hand reaching for the emergency frequency she had monitored thousands of times during her years as a pilot. She caught herself just in time, her fingers hovering over the radio controls as the weight of her situation crashed back over her. She was Maria Santos, cleaning lady. She had no authority here, no standing to offer advice or assistance. Her expertise was invisible, irrelevant, potentially dangerous to the carefully constructed life she had built, but the aircraft was in serious trouble, and the people on the ground were about to be in danger. Maria watched through the window as the F-16 continued its unstable approach, her military training warring with her civilian disguise. She could see exactly what needed to happen. The aircraft needed to abort this landing attempt and come around for another approach. The ground vehicles needed to be moved immediately, and someone needed to advise the pilot about wind conditions that were making his situation worse. The radio crackled with increasingly urgent communications between the tower and the emergency crews, but no one seemed to be addressing the fundamental problem with the approach. Maria found herself mentally flying the aircraft, her hands unconsciously moving through the corrections she would have made in the pilot's position. She had landed damaged aircraft before, had talked other pilots through similar emergencies. During her years as a flight instructor, she knew exactly how to save this situation, but she was just the cleaning lady. The F-16 touched down hard, bounced once, and then settled onto the runway with a squeal of tires and a shower of sparks from the damaged engine. The pilot managed to keep the aircraft on the centerline as it rolled out, finally coming to rest just short of the emergency vehicles that had positioned themselves near the end of the runway. Fire suppression crews swarmed the aircraft immediately, foam spraying across the engine compartment as the pilot shut down systems and prepared for evacuation. It had been a close call, but the crisis was over. Maria stood at the window for several more minutes, her heart rate slowly returning to normal as she watched the efficient emergency response unfold. The pilot emerged from the cockpit under his own power, waving off the medical personnel who rushed to assist him. The aircraft would need significant repairs, but both pilot and plane had survived what could have been a catastrophic accident. As the immediate drama subsided, Maria became aware that she was not alone in the office. Colonel Hayes stood in the doorway, her expression thoughtful as she observed Maria's intense focus on the emergency response. "Hell of a thing," the colonel said quietly. "Looked like it could have gone either way for a minute there." Maria nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her adrenaline was still elevated, her pilot's instincts fully engaged despite her efforts to suppress them. "You seemed pretty interested in the whole thing," Colonel Hayes continued, moving to stand beside Maria at the window. "Most people would have been running away from a potential crash, not watching it with that kind of focus." "I was just concerned," Maria managed, her voice carefully neutral. Colonel Hayes nodded slowly, but something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely satisfied with the explanation. "Have you ever been around military aircraft before? You seem to understand what was happening out there." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Maria couldn't begin to address. She had spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of scrutiny, 15 years maintaining the fiction that her interest in aircraft was purely casual. But something about the emergency had stripped away her usual caution, revealing glimpses of knowledge and training that didn't match her official identity. "I've worked here a long time," Maria said finally. "You pick things up." It was a weak deflection, and both women knew it. Colonel Hayes studied Maria's face for a long moment, her expression shifting from casual curiosity to something approaching suspicion. The silence stretched uncomfortably until the colonel's radio crackled with a request for her presence at the emergency scene. "I should go," Colonel Hayes said, but she paused at the doorway. "We should talk sometime, Maria. I have a feeling there's more to you than meets the eye." As the colonel's footsteps faded down the hallway, Maria sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling slightly from the aftereffects of adrenaline and fear. In the space of 20 minutes, her carefully maintained anonymity had suffered its first serious crack. She had let her guard down, allowed her true nature to show through, and now questions were being asked that she wasn't prepared to answer. The incident marked the beginning of the end of Maria Santos's invisible life at Whitmore Air Force Base. Forces were now in motion that would ultimately expose the truth she had worked so hard to conceal, revealing the decorated combat pilot who had been hiding in plain sight for 15 years. The question was no longer whether her secret would be discovered, but how much damage the revelation would cause to the life she had built and the people who thought they knew her. As Maria returned to her cleaning duties with shaking hands, she couldn't know that Colonel Hayes was already making inquiries, that the film crew in Hangar 3 had been documenting more than routine maintenance, or that within days her photograph would be recognized by someone who remembered Major Rosa Delgado very well indeed. The invisible woman was about to become visible again, whether she wanted it or not. Colonel Patricia Hayes prided herself on her ability to read people. 23 years in the Air Force had taught her to recognize when someone wasn't telling the complete truth, and Maria Santos had definitely been holding something back during their conversation after the emergency landing. The cleaning lady's reaction to the aircraft crisis had been too professional, too informed, too invested for someone whose only connection to military aviation was pushing a mop around hangars. That evening, Hayes sat in her office reviewing personnel files on her computer, ostensibly catching up on routine administrative work. But her mind kept returning to the woman at the window, the way she had tracked the damaged F-16's approach with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly what was happening and what could go wrong. Most civilians would have been terrified by the sight of a burning aircraft attempting an emergency landing. Maria Santos had watched with the clinical assessment of a professional. Hayes pulled up the Facility Services employee database and located Maria's file. The information was sparse: hired 15 years ago, excellent performance reviews, no disciplinary actions, no requests for advancement or transfer. Her emergency contact was listed as none, and her previous employment history showed only generic maintenance and cleaning positions. It was the kind of deliberately unremarkable background that actually stood out for its very blandness. Something was missing from this picture, and Colonel Hayes intended to find out what. The investigation begins the next morning. Hayes made an unscheduled visit to the Facility Services office, where she found the department supervisor, Tom Bradley, reviewing work schedules with his morning coffee. "Colonel," Bradley said, jumping to his feet. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to ask about one of your employees, Maria Santos. How long has she been with the company?" Bradley consulted his computer. "About 15 years now. Started right after I took over this department." "Why, is there a problem?" "Not a problem, just curious." "What can you tell me about her background?" Bradley shrugged. "Not much to tell. She's our most reliable employee, shows up every day, does quality work, keeps to herself. Doesn't cause any trouble, doesn't ask for much. To be honest, I barely have to manage her at all." "Any idea where she worked before coming here?" "Some kind of facilities maintenance, I think. But that was before my time. The previous supervisor hired her, and he retired years ago." Bradley's expression grew slightly concerned. "Is Maria in some kind of trouble? Because I can't imagine what for." Hayes shook her head. "Nothing like that. I'm just trying to place where I might have seen her before. She seems familiar." It was a harmless lie, but it reflected a growing certainty that Maria Santos was not who she appeared to be. Hayes thanked Bradley and left, her mind already working through the resources available to her for conducting a more thorough investigation of military records. Back in her office, Hayes placed a call to the base personnel office and requested access to historical records for all Air Force personnel who had served at Whitmore during the past 20 years. It was a fishing expedition, but her instincts told her that Maria's connection to the base ran deeper than her employment record suggested. The search took most of the afternoon, complicated by the sheer volume of personnel who had rotated through Whitmore during 2 decades of operations. Hayes methodically reviewed files, looking for anything that might connect to a woman who would now be in her early 50s and might have had reason to assume a false identity. She was about to give up when she found it. Major Rosa Maria Delgado, United States Air Force. Distinguished Flying Cross, Purple Heart, Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, and a commendation for exceptional valor during Operation Enduring Freedom. The photograph in the file was 15 years old, but the bone structure was unmistakable. Maria Santos and Major Rosa Delgado were the same person. Hayes stared at the computer screen in amazement as she read through Delgado's service record. Graduated top of her class from the Air Force Academy, flight training at Columbus Air Force Base, advanced fighter training, deployment to Afghanistan where she flew 147 combat missions as a fighter pilot and later as a squadron commander. She had been wounded in action when her F-16 was hit by ground fire, requiring emergency surgery to remove shrapnel from her shoulder and arm. After her recovery, she had been assigned to Whitmore as a flight instructor and squadron operations officer, and then, 15 years ago, she had simply disappeared from the military record. No retirement ceremony, no transfer orders, no forwarding address. According to the file, Major Rosa Delgado had requested and been granted an administrative discharge for personal reasons, and had last been seen clearing out her quarters in the bachelor officer housing on base. 3 months later, Maria Santos had been hired as a cleaning lady for the same facility where Major Delgado had once commanded respect as one of the Air Force's most decorated female combat pilots. The confrontation Hayes spent the rest of the day wrestling with the implications of her discovery. Rosa Delgado had been a legend at Whitmore, the kind of pilot other pilots talked about in reverent terms. Her combat record was extraordinary, her leadership abilities unquestioned, her technical knowledge encyclopedic. The idea that she had been working anonymously in the same hangars where she had once been honored seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. The next morning, Hayes arrived at the base early and positioned herself near Hangar 7, waiting for Maria to begin her routine. She found the cleaning lady methodically working her way around AC-130, the same focused efficiency that had characterized her for 15 years. But now Hayes could see what she had missed before, the way Maria automatically checked the aircraft's condition as she cleaned, the practiced eye that cataloged maintenance issues, the unconscious familiarity with systems and procedures that no civilian should possess. "Maria," Hayes called out, approaching slowly. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Maria looked up from her work, and Hayes saw a flash of resignation in her eyes. Perhaps she had been expecting this conversation, dreading it, knowing that her reaction to the emergency landing had revealed too much. "Of course, Colonel," Maria said, setting down her cleaning supplies. Hayes gestured toward a quiet corner of the hangar, away from the maintenance crews who were beginning to arrive for their morning shift. For a long moment, the two women simply looked at each other, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy between them. "I know who you are," Hayes said finally. "I know who you really are." Maria's shoulders sagged slightly, 15 years of carefully maintained pretense crumbling in an instant. "I figured you would, eventually. You're too smart not to put it together." Rosa Maria Delgado, Major, United States Air Force. Distinguished Flying Cross, Purple Heart, 147 combat missions in Afghanistan. Hayes's voice was quiet but filled with awe. "You're a legend around here. There are pilots who still talk about your missions, your leadership, your innovations in close air support tactics." "That was a long time ago," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. 15 years. The same 15 years you've been cleaning these hangars." Hayes stepped closer, her expression a mixture of confusion and respect. "Why? Why give up everything you had earned, everything you had accomplished?" Maria was quiet for so long that Hayes began to wonder if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, as if each one carried enormous weight. "Because I couldn't be that person anymore. The war, the things I saw, the decisions I had to make. I lost pieces of myself over there that I couldn't get back. When I came back to Whitmore, everyone expected me to be the same pilot I had been before. But I wasn't. I was broken in ways that didn't show up on medical examinations." She paused, her eyes focusing on something far beyond the hangar walls. "I tried to keep flying, tried to maintain the image of the decorated combat veteran, but every time I got in the cockpit, all I could think about were the missions that went wrong, the people who didn't come home, the weight of command decisions that cost lives. I was becoming a danger to myself and to anyone who flew with me. Hayes listened without interruption, recognizing the pain of someone who had given everything for their country and been left to deal with the consequences alone. So I walked away, Maria continued. Officially, it was for personal reasons, which was true enough. But really, I needed to become someone else, someone who wasn't responsible for life and death decisions, someone who could find peace in simple, honest work. Maria Santos could do that. Major Rosa Delgado couldn't. But why here? Hayes asked. Why stay at Whitmore, where everyone knew who you had been? A small, sad smile crossed Maria's face. Because this was the only place that felt like home. These hangars, these aircraft, this mission, it's all I've ever known. I couldn't bear to leave it completely, but I couldn't continue being part of it in the same way. So I found a way to stay connected while remaining invisible. And it worked for 15 years. Until yesterday, yes. Hayes shook her head in amazement. Do you have any idea how many people have been looking for you? How many former squadron mates have wondered what happened to Rosa Delgado? You have friends, colleagues, people who served under your command who would have helped you through whatever you were facing. That's exactly why I had to disappear, Maria said firmly. They remembered the woman I used to be, not the broken person I had become. Their expectations, their respect, their need for me to be strong, it was suffocating. I needed space to heal, to figure out who I could be if I wasn't defined by my rank, my medals, my reputation. And did you? Figure it out, I mean? Maria considered the question. I found peace. I found purpose in simple work that contributed to the mission without requiring me to carry the weight of command. I learned that there's honor in all kinds of service, not just the kind that makes headlines or earns decorations. The choice Hayes stood quietly for several minutes, processing everything she had learned. The discovery of Rosa Delgado's true identity raised complex questions about privacy, security, and the obligations of command. Technically, Maria had done nothing wrong, her background check for the cleaning position would have been minimal, and she had performed her duties admirably. For 15 years. But the knowledge that one of the Air Force's most decorated combat pilots had been working anonymously on base created unprecedented complications. What happens now? Maria asked, as if reading Hayes's thoughts. I don't know, Hayes admitted. This is uncharted territory for me. You haven't violated any regulations, haven't compromised security, haven't done anything except clean hangars and mind your own business. But your presence here under an assumed identity raises questions I'm not sure how to answer. Will you have to report it? Hayes considered the question carefully. Not necessarily. You're not using your real name, but you're not exactly hiding under a false identity either. Maria Santos is your middle name and your mother's maiden name, isn't it? Maria nodded. I wanted to disappear, but I didn't want to break any laws doing it. And your service record shows an honorable discharge for personal reasons. Everything you've done is technically legal. Hayes paused. But the bigger question is whether this can continue. Now that I know who you are, can you really go back to being invisible? It was a fair question, and Maria had been dreading the answer since the moment Colonel Hayes had approached her. The comfortable anonymity that had protected her for 15 years was gone, shattered by a moment of professional instinct that she couldn't take back. I don't know if I can, she admitted. And I don't know if I should. Maybe it's time for this charade to end. What would you want to do? If you could choose, I mean. Maria looked around the hangar, taking in the aircraft, the equipment, the familiar spaces that had been her sanctuary for so long. I love this work. I love being part of the mission, even in a small way. I love knowing that what I do contributes to the readiness and safety of the pilots who fly these aircraft. But I also know that my presence here under false pretenses puts you in an impossible position. Hayes nodded. It does. But it also presents an opportunity. What do you mean? Whitmore is getting a new mission. We're being tasked with developing advanced training programs for combat pilots transitioning to civilian careers, helping them process their experiences and find new purposes. The program needs someone who understands both sides of that transition, someone who has walked that path successfully. Maria stared at her in amazement. You're offering me a job? I'm offering Rosa Delgado a job. The question is whether you're ready to be her again, at least partially. The proposal hung between them like a lifeline thrown to someone who hadn't realized she was drowning. For 15 years, Maria had believed that her military identity was lost forever, that the decorated pilot she had been was incompatible with the person she had become. The possibility of reclaiming that identity while acknowledging her journey seemed almost too good to be true. "I would need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Hayes paused. "But while you're thinking, consider this. Maybe the reason you never felt comfortable leaving Whitmore completely was because your story here wasn't finished yet. Maybe Maria Santos was just a bridge between who you were and who you're meant to become." The resolution 3 weeks later, Rosa Maria Delgado walked through the gates of Whitmore Air Force Base wearing civilian professional attire and carrying a briefcase containing her employment contract as a program coordinator for the new Transition Services Initiative. The local newspaper had run a story about her return, focusing on her new role helping veterans adjust to civilian life while carefully omitting the details of her 15-year absence. Former squadron mates had reached out with messages of support and excitement about her return to the Air Force community. On her first morning back in an official capacity, she stopped by Hangar 7 where Tom Bradley was training her replacement, a young man named Carlos who seemed eager but overwhelmed by the scope of his new responsibilities. "Any advice for the new guy?" Bradley asked when he saw her approaching. Rosa smiled, remembering her own first day in this hangar 15 years earlier. "Pay attention to the aircraft. They'll tell you what they need if you know how to listen. And remember that every job here matters, whether people notice it or not." Carlos nodded earnestly, clearly not understanding the deeper meaning of her words but sensing their importance. As Rosa walked toward her new office in the administrative building, she passed the display case containing photographs of Whitmore's distinguished aviators. Her own picture was there, frozen in time at the moment of her greatest professional triumph. Below it, a new plaque had been added: Major Rosa M. Delgado, Distinguished Flying Cross, Purple Heart. Currently serving as Program Coordinator, Transition Services Initiative. A reminder that service takes many forms, and heroes are often found in the most unexpected places. She paused for a moment, studying the photograph of the young pilot she had been, then continued down the hallway toward her new life. Behind her, Carlos was already at work with his cleaning equipment, invisible to the officers and airmen who passed by, unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of another hidden story that might, 15 years from now, surprise everyone who thought they knew the truth about the ordinary people who keep extraordinary institutions running. Rosa's journey from decorated pilot to invisible cleaner and back to respected professional proved that identity is not fixed, that service can take countless forms, and that sometimes the most profound acts of courage involve the quiet choice to rebuild yourself from the ground up. Her story became a legend at Whitmore Air Force Base, not just for her combat heroics, but for her reminder that everyone carries hidden chapters, and that the measure of a person's worth cannot be determined by what is visible on the surface. In the end, the woman who had spent 15 years cleaning hangars discovered that she had really been cleaning herself, preparing for the moment when she would be ready to reclaim her place in the world she had never really left.